right, hey folks, it is October the 19th, and today we are talking about the following chapters, and that is chapters 50 and 51, and we have the terms for the chapters up on the board. That is, how is the estate divided up? Agriculture, peasants' rights, officials, trade, and time off. So, divided up? Oh, I don't know. What, do y'all want to do that? We'll see. But we'll just discuss it like normal. Hey, so like I mentioned to those of you in class, I'm going to have a primary source reading for you later on. I want to find something on village life. I mean, a lot of the stuff I have, it's kind of like a derogatory perspective, and so it makes peasants look like they're dumb and backwards and all this other stuff. And it goes to show just how a lot of the higher classes looked on serfs. Like nobility often looked on serfs as kind of being just kind of like backwards, mean-spirited people that had to be kept in their place for their own good. So not very like kind in a lot of ways, you might say. So let's go ahead and see what we have for terms up on here. So, well, I mean my images. So, all right. So the domain is like the part of the land that is controlled specifically by the Lord. And if you remember, the Lord each gets their own estate, and on their estate they have a manor, and usually the manor is within the confines of a castle. The estate can do many functions, but your book's correct in pointing out that the functions are for self-sufficiency. Real wealth was measured in land, not gold. Gold was seen as kind of like a corrupting element. It's a sign of greed. But if you worked hard off of agriculture, or at least if you had your peasants do it, that was seen as a noble way to reap wealth. And here on this points out that, see, it's divided into strips. They didn't really have fencing because the wood was seen as just a little too expensive. Woods were often kept intact. A lot of it was because it was a source of meat for nobility. One of the pastimes for the nobles was to hunt and to feast, things like that. And so peasants were not allowed to hunt throughout most of Europe and England. That was seen as a noble privilege. The reeve, as you've seen in your book, or sometimes they had also their own wardens. The wardens acted like law enforcement in a sense, where if they caught a peasant hunting, they could act as both judge and juror, so they could hang peasants in place where they spotted them in the woods poaching. So that was a very serious crime in medieval times. Whenever they planted their fields, each peasant had their own strips that they were supposed to do for the Lord and for themselves. When they worked these strips, they tended to plant, say, like only wheat or barley, or other forms of grain. And they would just let it go fallow. That means let it go wild, let weeds grow up there for the soil to replenish. Because if you keep planting the same crop within a segment of soil over and over again, it depletes a lot of the minerals and the nutrients, and eventually the crops will not come up, and they won't produce flour or grain that you'll need for life. Later on, we're going to see post-Renaissance, you're going to see scientific method is going to be applied to agriculture. And they're going to realize that if you rotate crops, some plants will actually replenish some of those nutrients that plants need, such as nitrogen, back into the soil. But they didn't know this at this time. Most of the fertilizer was simply taken from animal dung or people dung, and they would spread it throughout the field, but that can only do so much. As we talked about before, the peasants lived together, and that's for protection within close proximity of both the church and also the Lord's manor for protection. They didn't live like spaced out in little cabins on their own plots of land like you'll see later on in America. Um, of course, the Lord's lands could also do many other things, such as orchards for, say, like a vineyard or for fruit and things like that for some of their exports. Because one set estate might trade with another. You have the blacksmith, the baker, house of the priest. You have the common pasture where the peasants' animals were allowed to graze, but the peasants were only allowed to have so many animals because the land had to be used evenly. Um, they were only allowed to get so much firewood, um, so much, say, from the orchard, so much wood from the woods, and also like other things you might use for like basket making, repairing their houses and stuff like that. Um, they could use the mill to turn their grain into flour and things like that, but they still had to pay for it, and they were taxed on top of that. So it was a position of poverty that no matter how hard you worked in, you could never get out of. And so this really killed a lot of incentive. This system of planting and working the fields is going to last a very long time without innovation. But the good news is it's going to be very effective when the weather's good as far as bringing in calories. So you're going to see like a population growth within medieval times. So here's an idyllic painting from the late Renaissance of peasants over here. You have some guys, they're reaping the fields. There's the ladies raking it together for threshing. You see there's some fruit-bearing trees in the background, a nice idyllic castle. Everybody's just doing all right. There's another one. As you see, there's different functions going on. You have goats for meat and milk. Sometimes they get out and they eat the grapes. Here, see, peasants are plowing the field. Well-to-do peasants had metal tools, but most peasants used wood to do things such as to plow and to dig up just whatever they needed to do. So it was really hard work. It was much harder than you might think of today than by doing it by hand. Everything that they had, almost everything, was made by them. Um, Wool was gathered from the sheep that they raised, and then it was spun into cloth, and then the women made it into the textiles and the clothing they need. If they had dye, they either had to provide it themselves, or if they were lucky, trade for some of it. Of course, food and animals all came from here, building material. So it really was like just like living on their own little islands, one island after another. Um, or see a simple manner of dress. People didn't really have a lot of cash to throw around buying nice clothes and things like that. So things were pretty much functional and modest. Of course, you have to remember that Christian sensibility in these times really espoused modesty. So people kind of just lived out their little lives and they hoped for a better existence in the next realm. However, we do see that it's going to be very effective as far as population growth. But then two bad things are going to happen around here. What do you think those two things are? The plague and something else called the mini ice age. And the plague is going to decimate Europe. And the mini ice age is going to further hurt Europe, but it's also going to hurt the Americas too. You're going to see the population in America of Native Americans is going to dwindle very quickly, much faster than in Europe, because most Native Americans within America were hunters and gatherers. And whenever there was a change in the climate, a natural change in the climate that dropped the temperature around the world, wildlife tended to vanish. And because of that, the hunters and gatherers, I think something like the population dropped by 50%, maybe even more in America before Columbus ever came over. So this was really a worldwide time of population drop. And of course, Europe wasn't the only place, and England wasn't the only place that faced the plague. We know that it was all throughout Asia and Russia, the Middle East, It was going all over the place. But yeah, we're going to talk about that later. But in any case, when times were good, the weather was good, serfdom worked really well. Feudalism provided a lot of space for family growth and stuff. And these records are actually pretty accurate because you got to remember, their villages were built around a church, and their priests and clergy were very good about documenting two things: baptismal names. So whenever in Catholicism you have a little baby, you baptize the baby, and they write down the name within the parish book. It's called the Book of Life. And so they write it down. And whenever somebody dies, they also write down their funeral and the name of that person in remembrance for prayers and stuff. So we have very accurate records from these little churches of the birth rate and the death rate. So that's how we're able to have good information on this. Yeah, it's really so happy little peasants. Of course, I mean, like it had its. If you remember, it had its own functioning government. It had its own functioning, all kinds of stuff. Here, let me close something out here real quick. Let's see. Sorry, I was told to join a Zoom meeting, and I was like, but I'm teaching, so I just opened it in the background. So, shh. It wasn't something that really pertained to me anyway. All right, kids. So that's the images for the day, and let's go ahead to our turns. So, how was the estate divided up?
By acres.
By acres. Okay, yeah. So acre is a metric of land that we got from England. But how is it divided up for its use? Yeah. So farming plots divided into long strips. So this is very different from the idealistic American independent farmer. You get your family in your covered wagon, you go out west, you get your own plot of land with your little cabin, you go bear hunting and all that stuff. No independence. This is like the complete opposite. This is more like farming as in servitude. So in long strips, what else about that, the characteristics of this could you tell us? So it's in long strips, and they usually had to have the source for a few things as well. So what was one thing that they could all share? Share land, yeah. We call them they could share the commons. And the commons could do two things. It's a plot of land where the peasants could agree to grow their own food and stuff. Like, hey, I want to have a vegetable garden, things like that. Or, hey, we want to have a little extra land to put our animals out. We want to have some hogs or something like that. So it was shared land that the Lord was like, hey, you guys just figure it out. What else, for firewood? They also had
Forest.
Yeah, they had forest. And of course, they also had water access. And now I know I'm saying a lot of negative things. It wasn't all negative because there's a lot of things culturally speaking that the peasants actually had pretty good just generations of their own cultural build-up, holidays, forms of entertainment, their stories, their folk tales and things. So it's going to be something that's going to become very culturally unique. So water access. And also, of course, the meadow for the animals. And the village. And so you have a place for just about everybody's need. Now, not in modern terms, it's obviously missing schools, a place for medical care. I mean, you don't see, well, yeah, kind of, yeah. So what they could do, some villages, larger villages, of course, Well, see, that's the thing. See, a lot of the things like that, as far as like hospitals and orphanages and things like that, and even education things, that's going to be in something that's a lot like this. But instead of having a Lord's castle, it's going to be a monastery. And so, yeah, the church. So, yeah, you'd have a monastery instead of this big castle thing here. And so then, yeah, it might have an orphanage and, a little school to teach people either how to be clerics for like a king or like more priests and monks and stuff. So, yeah. But otherwise, yeah, it was even like they were self-sufficient like this, where they would have fields for planting and they might produce things. A lot of times estates were good at producing one thing. Like you might have an estate where they're really good at breeding horses. And so everybody wants to get their horses, but they still do a lot of farming. You might have a state that's good at making wine or beer, or they might do beekeeping because honey and fruit were the only sweeteners they had back then. You just couldn't like buy some, I don't know, Splenda or whatever. So, all right, agriculture. So how was agriculture done? Everybody's looking at Zoe. All right, someone's got Zoe.
So like they all like shared land that was their lords, and they just worked it for them.
Yeah.
But like they didn't know how to like fertilize the
Yeah.
ground, so they like cultivated some stuff and then left the rest just to grow in hopes that the land would be fertilized and like good for use.
Yeah, they would. So they would let 1/3 of the land go fallow. That means wild. And so that was the only way they could figure out how to replenish the land. So it was very, very inefficient. 1/3 of the countryside eventually became worthless for like a couple of years. And we didn't mention this, but a lot of the work they did, yes, it was for the Lord. In some places, it might be the peasants worked 2 days out of the week for the Lord. In some places, it might be 4 days out of the week. So not all of their labor, their sweat, and their work, and all that stuff goes back to them. It goes to the Lord for the right of them to live on the Lord's estate. Who was also their judge and their protector and their lawmaker and all these things. You would say? Execution. Could be. Yeah, could be. If you broke the wrong law, right? Now, peasants' rights. So it's kind of weird because like peasants did have certain rights to the property though. Now we didn't talk about like their individual rights because it's kind of strange because peasants did have property rights. Lords were not allowed to go into peasants' homes without permission. They couldn't take the peasants' stuff legitimately. If they were like, "Hey, I like your horse; it's mine now," they couldn't do that. But they could still tax them. They could prevent them from having the right to move to another village or to change their job or like go to a different kind of church or something like that. They didn't have those rights. So in many ways, it was kind of very restrictive. But as far as land rights, what did they have the right to use?
They could like cut like a limited amount of hay from the middle
Yeah.
for like their personal use and turn away farming or something.
Some hay,
And
some farmland,
he also was able to go into the forest to cut down trees.
some wood.
So it could be nice and warm.
What about critters? Some farm animals. But they couldn't have the wild ones, even like rabbits and squirrels and stuff. They'd have to be very secretive and like try to trap them and then cook them in the middle of the night and not get caught. So, like meat was a very rare thing for a medieval peasant to enjoy. One thing that peasants will have access to is usually fish. So a lot of times these manors, they try to be built near good sized rivers. And so there's going to be a period actually in Europe during the early days of America being colonized. Europeans are going to overfish Europe so much that they're going to deplete, virtually wipe out a lot of the fish throughout Europe. They're going to eat so much of them. So that's why you're going to have so much fishing off the American coast. There's a big demand. So, all right. So far out. So yeah, they had some property rights, but they don't really get to own any of it, right? I mean, if you remember back to our theory of land ownership, it was all the kings. And that's going to transfer to America too. Because whenever we talk about, like, say, the Spanish conquering so much of Central and South America, that's all going to be the king's land. So, all right, officials. What kind of like government officials do they have in the estate?
A headman or a reeve.
Yeah, so a reeve. This is actually where we get the word sheriff from. Like a shire is kind of like a town you could think of, and a reeve, like the reeve of the shire. And so yeah, what did they do?
They represented the peasants. Whenever the peasants had to go to the Lord and like for some legal stuff, they're like, I got you, man.
Yeah, so they're like a peasant representative.
Yeah, the lawyer.
But they can also act as a cop for the government or the Lord. And, okay, so that takes care of a lot of the middlemen because peasants, the last thing that the local lord wanted was to have his serfs coming into his nice, clean manor and like hollering about how the neighbor's pig went in and ate out of his garden all day. Like the pig, like he didn't want to hear that kind of stuff. You know, they wanted to keep a good distinction or separation. This was a class-based system, and they did not want to have to mess around with the lower classes. So, hey, do they have any other like officials?
The constable.
Constable, who was kind of below the reeve, right?
And like he enforced the orders of the reeve and carried messages around to people.
Oh, there we go. Orders, and we'll leave it at that. And they also had, of course, the warden, who protected the Lord's property. So and of course there's other things, you know, talk about like people who have like jobs, like you might have like blacksmiths and the millers and things like that. And depending on what else they grew, there might be other people with special jobs. But a lot of the refined manufacturing things are actually being in Italy. That did have some feudalism, but they're going to get out of it pretty quickly compared to the rest of Europe. All right, the last one, trade and time off. Was there a lot of trade going on?
No. Because they're like, we can make all this stuff at home.
Yeah, not much trade, which is kind of nice. I mean, I would like to be able to make everything I need, but nobody's got time for that.
But like they did trade for like salt, so like salt fish and stuff.
Yes, only in necessities. Yeah, so like salt and stuff they couldn't make. And there's gonna be some things like the lords are gonna do much of the trade. And that's gonna be for what we might call I can't think of a term, but it's gonna be like goods that are for essentially expensive items, like weapons and armor, of course, but also art, like fine dinnerware, maybe furniture, and things that are expensive that you would expect an upper class person to own, of course. And time off. What about that time off? Now that's a good thing about a peasant.
They had holidays.
Lots of holidays.
Yes. Like
Lots and lots.
about 8 weeks in every year, they had like 3 days of work.
Yeah, they had extended like here in America, most people they're like, hey, it's Easter. That's one day, right? It's Sunday. No, for them, Easter was like a long time. Same with like Christmas was also more of a season. They also had saint days, or like particular for holy people that they recognized. They'd have a day off for them. Different things like like events out of the Bible, like when Jesus is baptized, or just things like that. They'll have the day off. So yeah, they would have a lot of time off, lots of holidays, and of course Sunday. So they weren't forced to work on Sundays, because like I told you, religion was very important, especially Christianity to medieval people. There are, of course, other groups of people, such as Jewish people, but they tended to be kind of marginalized and pretty rare back then. Anti-Semitism, like looking down upon Jewish people, was a pretty common European problem. Some kingdoms they weren't allowed to be in, some they weren't. And there's going to be periods of pushback against these people throughout time. But we'll talk more about that later. So that's going to end our little lecture today. We're going to go over the next two chapters, which are super short tomorrow. And then we might have one chapter out of the next thing, because we got another big section on Christianity, but we already talked most about it. So we're just going to do like one or two of those, and we're going to talk about the Crusades this week. So, all right, talk to you later, kids.